It's true. My television shows have been canceled. That includes Roadkill and Roadkill Garage and, of course, Engine Masters. And Motor Trend has also ceased production on Faster with Newbern and Cotton, Roadworthy Rescues, and Hot Rod Garage.
David Freiberger and Mike Finnegan spent 12 years proving that you don't need a trailer or a plan, just a zip tie and a dream. They built a kingdom on junk, turning rusted-out failures into the biggest car show on the planet. But in the end, it wasn't a blown engine or a snapped frame that killed Roadkill. It was a corporate pen stroke. The world's greatest car show didn't run out of gas. It got towed by a spreadsheet. Why the suits pulled the plug. When the news finally broke that Roadkill was dead, the internet didn't just get angry. It got confused. Fans went looking for a smoking gun, expecting to find a story about plummeting ratings, a massive falling out between Freiberger and Finnegan, or perhaps just a lack of rusted-out Mopars left in the American desert. But the truth David Freiberger eventually laid bare was far more sterile and, in a way, much more insulting. The show wasn't canceled because people stopped watching. It was canceled because the company that owned it decided to stop being a media company and start being a debt repayment machine. To understand the kill shot, you have to look at the chaotic, multi-billion-dollar marriage of Discovery and Warner Brothers. When these two giants merged into Warner Brothers Discovery, WBD, they inherited a mountain of debt so high it had its own weather system. In the world of high finance restructuring, niche is a dirty word. WBD didn't want to run a specialized enthusiast network like Motor Trend Plus. They wanted massive, broad appeal hits that could fill a generic streaming bucket like Max. Roadkill was the king of its hill, but that hill was no longer visible from the windows of a Manhattan skyscraper. Freiberger's revelation pulled back the curtain on a cold reality. The internal production house at Motor Trend, the actual team of camera operators, editors, and producers who lived in the dirt and shared the grease with the hosts, was simply dissolved. It wasn't a surgical strike on one show, it was a wholesale liquidation of a creative culture. In late 2024, Hearst magazines stepped in to buy the remains of the Motor Trend brand. Hearst, a legendary name in publishing, wanted the brand's history, the magazine archives, and the digital footprint. What they didn't want was the massive, messy bill that comes with filming two guys breaking cars in the middle of nowhere. The most jarring part of the reveal wasn't the corporate math, but the lack of a human goodbye. Freiberger hinted at a professional environment that had become cold and disconnected. There was no gold watch, no final wrap party, and no official phone call from the top floor to explain the legacy they were ending. The green light simply never turned on for the next season. The corporate machinery didn't hate Roadkill. It just didn't see it as anything more than a row on a spreadsheet. While fans were mourning the end of an era, the executives were likely looking at a PowerPoint slide where the show was nothing more than a box to be checked off to save on overhead. Freiberger admitted that the writing had been on the wall for a long time. As the show moved further away from its YouTube roots and deeper into the Discovery ecosystem, the layers of management grew thick and suffocating. Decisions that used to be made over a beer in a parking lot were now being filtered through multiple departments: legal, HR, brand safety, none of whom knew a carburetor from a camshaft. By the time the Hearst deal was finalized, the show was essentially an orphan. Hearst is a publishing powerhouse, not a video studio. They bought a magazine company, and Roadkill was a television show that happened to be awkwardly attached to it like a rusted-on fender. The final insult was the fate of the stars themselves, the cars. In a traditional corporate media setup, the vehicles aren't memories, they are props owned by the studio. When the lights went out, The Rotson, the muscle truck, and the General Mayhem were just assets to be liquidated. This wasn't a creative decision. It was an inventory clearing. If Freiburger hadn't stepped up with his own checkbook to rescue those cars from the corporate chopping block, the physical history of 12 years of television would have been crushed for scrap value. The company was willing to turn icons into cubes of metal just to clear a warehouse floor. This cancellation was a symptom of a larger shift in how we consume media. Roadkill lived in the middle class of production. Too expensive to be a simple vlog, but too gritty to be a mainstream TV hit. As the industry polarized into free social content on one side and massive streaming blockbusters on the other, that middle ground evaporated. The suits didn't kill the show because it failed. They killed it because they no longer had a box that it fit inside. They were cleaning a house and threw away the crown jewels because they didn't recognize the value of something covered in oil. It's the ultimate irony of the digital age. You can build the most loyal audience in the world, but if your contract is owned by a company trying to pay off a merger, your loyalty is just another liability. David and Mike were doing their best work, but they were doing it for a landlord who was planning to tear the building down for a parking lot. But to understand why this corporate hit job hurt the fans so much, you have to go back to when things were actually fun. The accidental revolution. In 2012, the automotive media landscape was a desert of bleached teeth hosts and fake reality TV deadlines. If you flipped on a car show, you were greeted by polished chrome, scripted arguments, and shops that looked cleaner than a surgical suite. Then came Roadkill. It started as a desperate experiment by the original YouTube Original Channel Initiative, a time when Google was throwing money at traditional publishers like Hot Rod Magazine to see if they could pivot to video. They didn't give Freiburger and Finnegan a massive budget or a writer's room. They just gave them a camera and told them to do something. What happened next was a happy accident that changed the internet. David Freiburger, the encyclopedic editor-in-chief of Hot Rod, and Mike Finnegan, his equally talented and cynical counterpart, decided to stop pretending. They stopped trying to make television and started making a mess. The first few episodes were essentially home movies with high production values. They went to a junkyard, bought something that shouldn't run, and tried to drive it across the country. There was no reveal at the end where a shiny car rolled out from under a silk sheet. Usually, the reveal was just the car dying on the side of the I-15 at 2 a.m. while the guys laughed through the delirium of heat stroke. This was the birth of the roadkill philosophy. Don't get it right, just get it running. For a generation of gearheads who grew up feeling intimidated by the perfection of professional builders, this was a revelation. It was permission to be mediocre. It was proof that you didn't need a $100,000 shop to have a $1 million experience. By leaning into the failures, the broken leaf springs, the overheating engines, the zip-tied fenders, they tapped into a vein of authenticity that the suits in Hollywood could never replicate. They weren't just showing you how to fix a car, they were showing you how to survive one. The numbers were staggering. Almost overnight, Roadkill became the crown jewel of the Motor Trend YouTube channel. They weren't just getting views, they were building a cult. Fans started carrying zip ties in their glove boxes like religious icons. Roadkill became a verb. If your car broke down and you fixed it with a piece of wire and a prayer, you were roadkilling it. This wasn't just a show anymore. It was a subculture. The chemistry between Freiburger and Finnegan was the secret sauce. You could tell these guys actually liked each other, and more importantly, they actually liked the junk they were driving. It was a bromance fueled by 87 octane and bad ideas. As the show exploded, it started to influence the very industry it came from. Traditional magazines began to realize that readers didn't just want to see the finished product. They wanted to see the blood, sweat, and tears, mostly grease, that went into it. Roadkill sparked a massive wave of vlog-style automotive content. Every kid with a GoPro and a rusty Civic was trying to capture that same lightning in a bottle. But while others tried to copy the format, they couldn't copy the decades of deep nerd institutional knowledge that David and Mike brought to the table. They could identify a cylinder head from 50 yards in the dark, and that credibility gave them the street cred to do whatever they wanted. By 2015, Roadkill was the biggest thing in the automotive world. They were hosting Roadkill Nights on Woodward Avenue, shutting down city streets for legal drag racing. They were selling merchandise by the shipping container. They had successfully bridged the gap between the old-school print world and the new-school digital frontier. For a brief moment in time, it felt like the creators had won. They had bypassed the gatekeepers, ignored the rules of broadcasting, and built an empire on a foundation of rust. It was a golden era, where the only thing that mattered was the next road trip and whether or not the car would make it to the gas station. But the problem with building a kingdom is that eventually the emperors of the old world take notice. As the view counts climbed into the tens of millions, the corporate parents at the time, Source Interlink and later Discovery, realized they were sitting on a gold mine. And like any corporate entity sitting on a gold mine, their first instinct wasn't to keep digging. It was to put a fence around it and start charging admission. The very success that made Roadkill a revolution was exactly what made it a target for the corporate monetization strategies that would eventually lead to its demise. They were the kings of the internet. But then someone decided it was time to grow up and get a job. The paywall prison. The decline of Roadkill didn't start with a cancellation notice. It started with an invitation to a premium experience. In 2018, the corporate masters at Discovery and Motor Trend looked at their massive YouTube audience, millions of loyal, highly engaged viewers, and saw a missed opportunity for recurring monthly revenue. They decided to pull the rug out from under the very platform that built them. The directive was clear. If you wanted to see Freiburger and Finnegan on their release date, you had to leave the free global ecosystem of YouTube and migrate to the Motor Trend Plus app. It was the birth of Netflix for gearheads, and for Roadkill, it was the beginning of the end. This move was a classic corporate miscalculation of how digital community works. YouTube isn't just a video player, it's a social square. By moving the show behind a paywall, the company didn't just ask for $4.99 a month, they effectively cut the show's vocal cords. The comment sections, the memes, the organic sharing, and the water cooler moments that made the show a viral sensation evaporated overnight. A show that used to get 5 million views in a week was suddenly playing to a premium audience that was a fraction of the size. The energy shifted from a global movement to a gated community. Behind the scenes, the paywall changed the soul of the production. Once you are a subscription service, the metrics for success change. On YouTube, you need to be exciting, raw, and shareable to beat the algorithm. On a private app, you just need to keep people from hitting the unsubscribe button. This led to a subtle but undeniable smoothing out of the edges. The episodes became longer, more formulaic, and more produced. The grit that made the early seasons feel like a secret shared between friends was replaced by the polished requirements of a streaming network. The suits wanted Roadkill to look like real TV, failing to realize that the whole reason we loved it was that it looked like the opposite of TV. Freiburger has since hinted at the frustration of this era. Imagine being a creator who used to talk to the whole world, only to find yourself shouting into a soundproof room. The feedback loop was broken. The younger generation of car enthusiasts, the ones who didn't have credit cards or the desire to manage another monthly subscription, simply found other heroes to watch for free on YouTube. While Roadkill was locked in its paywall prison, a new wave of independent creators like Cletus McFarland and Tavarish were rising to fill the void, using the exact same unfiltered blueprint that Freiburger and Finnegan had pioneered. The Netflix for Gearheads dream eventually became a nightmare of corporate restructuring. As MotorTrend Plus struggled to hit the massive subscriber targets required to satisfy the Discovery-Warner Brothers merger debt, the pressure on the production team intensified. They were asked to do more with less, or rather, to do more content to justify the subscription price. We started seeing spin-offs and recycled footage, Roadkill Extra, Roadkill Garage, Faster with Finnegan. While some of these were excellent, the sheer volume of content started to dilute the brand. The event status of a new Roadkill episode was replaced by a constant stream of good enough video designed to keep the app's new arrivals rail populated. Furthermore, the paywall created a massive geographical divide. For years, Roadkill had a massive international following in places like Australia, the UK, and Scandinavia. When the show moved to the app, many of these fans were hit with "content not available in your region" messages. The corporate lawyers hadn't bothered to clear the international rights for the very audience that helped make the show a hit. This wasn't just a business mistake, it was a betrayal of the global gearhead community. You can't claim to be the home of car culture while locking the doors to half the world. As the years in the paywall prison dragged on, the disconnect between the creators and the owners reached a breaking point. The suits were focused on churn rates and subscriber acquisition costs, while Freiburger and Finnegan were still just trying to get a 1,500 horsepower engine to stay cool in a car made of recycled soda cans. The corporate entity saw Roadkill as an IP asset to be leveraged. The hosts saw it as their life's work. When the Warner Brothers Discovery merger finally prioritized cost-cutting over content creation, the paywall didn't protect the show. It just made it easier to delete. The irony is that the paywall was supposed to be the next level that secured the show's future. Instead, it became a tomb. It isolated the show from the cultural zeitgeist, alienated the next generation of fans, and made the brand entirely dependent on the whims of a parent company that was more interested in tax write-offs than tachometers. By the time the app was folded into Discovery Plus, and eventually Max, Roadkill had become a ghost of its former self, haunted by the memory of the millions of YouTube fans it left behind in 2018. Behind the scenes, the mechanics weren't just fighting rusty bolts. They were fighting spreadsheets. The Stubby Bob effect. Why chemistry can't be scripted. In the middle of the corporate storm, there was a vehicle that perfectly encapsulated why Roadkill worked. Stubby Bob. It was a 1950 Ford F6 dump truck with a wheelbase so short it looked like a cartoon. It was objectively useless, dangerously unstable, and eventually it did a massive, bumper-dragging wheelie that became one of the most iconic moments in automotive history. But the Stubby Bob effect wasn't about the truck. It was about the two guys inside it. You could give any other show a short wheelbase truck and a big block engine, but you couldn't give them the genuine, unscripted joy that radiated from Freiburger and Finnegan. The suits at the networks have spent decades trying to manufacture on-screen chemistry. They use casting directors, chemistry reads, and focus groups to find the perfect pairing. They usually end up with two people who look great under studio lights, but wouldn't spend 5 minutes together in the real world. Freiburger and Finnegan were different because they weren't cast. They were colleagues who became brothers through shared suffering. When a transmission exploded at midnight in the middle of a desert, Their frustration wasn't for the cameras. It was the real, raw exhaustion of two guys who just wanted to get to a Motel 6. This authenticity created a parasocial relationship with the audience that was incredibly powerful. Fans didn't just watch Roadkill to see cars. They watched it to hang out with Dave and Mike. This is a nuance that corporate spreadsheets fail to capture. A spreadsheet can tell you how much a camera crew costs per hour, but it can't calculate the value of a genuine laugh when a hood flies off at 60 miles per hour. The chemistry was the ultimate defense against the show becoming just another boring how-to program. It was a comedy show where the props happened to be internal combustion engines. Whenever the production felt too corporate, the hosts would subvert it. You could see it in the way they'd look directly into the lens and acknowledge the absurdity of their situation. They were the audience's representatives inside the machine. If a producer wanted them to pretend a deadline was life or death, they'd usually respond by taking a nap or eating a gas station hot dog. This defiance was the secret to their longevity. Even as the logos on their shirts changed from Hot Rod to Discovery to Warner Brothers, the guys in the shirts stayed the same. This is also why the various spin-offs and hosted versions of Roadkill never quite hit the same heights. You can copy the junk car format, but you can't copy the decades of shared history. Freiburger's encyclopedic Professor of Greece personality was the perfect foil to Finnegan's mad scientist energy. One would explain the volumetric efficiency of a cylinder head, while the other was trying to figure out how to mount a leaf blower to a carburetor. It was a balance of intellect and insanity that made even a 40-minute episode about a broken fuel pump feel like a masterpiece. The corporate entities eventually realized they couldn't replace the hosts, so they tried to manage them. They surrounded them with more structure, more rules, and more brand-safe environments. But the Stubby Bob effect proved that the magic only happened when things were out of control. The best moments in the show's history were the ones the producers probably tried to talk them out of. You can't script a wheelie in a dump truck. And you certainly can't script the look on Mike Finnegan's face when he realizes they actually pulled it off. Even the best chemistry, however, couldn't survive a multi-billion-dollar debt restructuring. The Great Liquidation. Buying back the soul. In late 2024, the Roadkill story hit its most heartbreaking chapter. When a corporate media entity dissolves a production unit, it doesn't just stop filming, it clears the books. For Warner Brothers Discovery and the transition to Hearst, the legendary Roadkill fleet, the physical heart of the show, was no longer a collection of cultural icons. To the auditors, they were depreciated assets, taking up expensive square footage in a Santa Ana warehouse. The order was given. The fleet had to go. For fans, the thought of the Rotson or the muscle truck being sent to a generic public auction, or worse, a scrap crusher, was unthinkable. These weren't just cars, they were characters. They represented 12 years of late nights, broken knuckles, and roadside miracles. But in the cold eyes of a corporate liquidation, a car that doesn't have a title or a working floorboard is a liability. There was a very real danger that the history of the show would be scattered to the four winds or destroyed for a tax write-off. This is where the story shifts from a tragedy to a rescue mission. David Freiburger, refusing to let the legacy be turned into scrap metal, stepped up with his own checkbook. In a move that felt like a final roadkill project, he negotiated to buy back a significant portion of the fleet. He didn't do it because he needed more project cars. He already has a lifetime supply. He did it because he knew that if he didn't save them, no one would. He ended up purchasing 11 of the most iconic vehicles from the show, including the legendary Stubby Bob. The image of Freiburger personally trailering these rusted hulks away from the corporate warehouse was the ultimate full circle moment. It was a literal reclamation of the show's soul. By buying the cars back, he transitioned them from studio props back into personal projects. He wasn't just saving metal, he was saving the ability to tell future stories. If he owns the cars, the corporate suits can't tell him he's not allowed to film them. He effectively bought back his own creative freedom, one rusted chassis at a time. Finnegan, too, made sure to grab the pieces of history that mattered most to him, ensuring the fleet stayed within the family. This act of defiance sent a powerful message to the fans. The brand might be owned by a conglomerate, but the spirit belongs to the guys who built it. The Liquidation, which was intended to be the final punctuation mark on the Roadkill era, instead became the bridge to the next one. The cars were no longer bound by corporate insurance policies or production schedules. They were back in the hands of the men who loved them. There is something poetic about the fact that the show ended exactly how it began, with David Freiburger standing in front of a bunch of junk, figuring out how to get it home. The corporate machine tried to treat Roadkill like a disposable product, but you can't dispose of a legacy when the creators are willing to put their own skin and cash in the game to keep it alive. The fleet was safe, but the environment had changed forever. The corporate name is dead, but the keys are back in the right hands. The new era, independence and the full circle. The death of Roadkill as a corporate entity didn't result in a funeral. It resulted in a jailbreak. For years, Freiburger and Finnegan had been employees of a massive machine, working under the constraints of production schedules, insurance waivers, and the ever-shifting goals of a streaming app. But when the lights went out at Motor Trend Productions in late 2024, the talent didn't just disappear. They went back to where they started, YouTube, and this time they took the keys with them. By early 2025, the landscape of automotive media shifted back toward the creators. David Freiburger leaned heavily into his personal channel, the David Freiburger Channel, while Mike Finnegan continued to explode on Finnegan's Garage. The irony was immediate and glaring. While the corporate giants were folding their hands and claiming there was no money left in high-quality car content, the individual channels of the men they let go were racking up millions of views. The fans didn't want the Motor Trend brand. They wanted the guys. This new era of independence allowed for a full circle moment that had been impossible under the corporate thumb. In mid-2025, David and Mike announced a reunion. They didn't need a network greenlight or a production budget. They just needed a camera and a road trip. They got back together to drive the Rotson, the notoriously unreliable Datsun 240Z, across the country. It was the ultimate take that to the suits. They were proving that the magic of Roadkill wasn't in the IP or the trademarked logo. It was in the friendship and the mechanical misery that they were now free to share with the world, for free, on their own terms. Freed from the production house model, the content actually improved. It felt more like 2012 again. There were no more fake deadlines or over-edited montages designed to keep a subscriber from clicking away. Instead, we got long-form, nerdy deep dives into engine builds and the genuine, rambling conversations that happen when you're stuck in a car for 12 hours. Freiburger even branched out into field reporting for the NHRA and announcing at events like Cletus McFarlane's Freedom 500, integrating himself deeper into the grassroots car community that the corporate world had forgotten how to reach. The cancellation of Roadkill actually turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to the fans. It broke the paywall and returned the kings to their throne on the open internet. It proved that in the digital age, you can't truly cancel someone who owns their own tools and has a direct line to their audience. The corporate entity known as Roadkill might be sitting in a folder on a server at Warner Brothers. Discovery. But the Roadkill spirit is currently being uploaded to YouTube in 4K, one greasy episode at a time. In the end, it turns out, you can't cancel a guy with a trailer and a toolbox. The lesson of Roadkill. The saga of Roadkill is far more than a chronicle of rusted fenders and blown gaskets. It is a masterclass in the enduring power of authenticity over corporate assets. By attempting to polish, paywall, and package a grassroots movement, the media conglomerates accidentally proved a fundamental truth. You cannot manufacture heart with a spreadsheet. David Freiburger and Mike Finnegan didn't just host a show. They built a global kingdom held together by zip ties, shared failures, and an uncompromising refusal to play by the rules of traditional television. When the walls of that kingdom were finally torn down by a cold corporate merger, the creators didn't panic. They simply walked out of the wreckage, picked up their tools, and started building something new. Their journey reveals that a brand is only as strong as the trust it shares with its audience. While the trademarked name might remain trapped in a boardroom filing cabinet, the spirit of the show proved to be uncontainable. They demonstrated that as long as there are old cars to fix and genuine friends to break them with, the story never truly ends. The road goes on, but finally, it is free of the suits. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel for more riveting stories just like this.